I worked in a prison in Iraq. We were training Iraqis to take over the prison. We had about 8 separate buildings known as K-spans. We had turned one over to the Iraqis just to see how they could handle it. They didn't do well. When we got the call, we were just about to get off a 12-hour shift. We were in the middle of a shift change, so both shifts were present. Apparently, the detainees thought this would be a confusing time for the guards, but instead, it meant we had double the manpower. Back to the cells. The Iraqis had lost the whole building. The detainees had started a riot, and one cell, which contained about 20 men, was able to break a hole in the cell and escape. Luckily, there are 2 more layers of razor-wired fence that they had to get through before freedom. We get a call saying they need help at the K-span. We grab tasers, riot shields, and flexi-cuffs and start running. Of the 2 layers of razor wire to freedom, we are now inside the same layer as about 100 escaped detainees. From outside the fences, other guard forces see us rushing into the riot and all scream, "Screw 'em up." It was a very charged situation. The run was about 500 yards. As I approached the K-span, I could see the Iraqi correctional officers, ICOs, in the rec room. They have makeshift weapons trying to defend themselves from escaped detainees, 2x4s and other debris from the building being destroyed. They were screwed. Detainees hated them, probably more so than Americans. They saw them as traitors, which, if I were in a detainee's shoes, I would too. And now it's 100 versus 10. We can only see the rec yard, not access it. We had to run around to the entrance and go through the building to get to it. Basically, there was a riot of 100 men between us and the ICOs. We had to get the riot under control before we can help them. I was about the 10th US Guard Force to show up. We immediately ran inside the building. It was chaos. Inside the K-span, there are 20 cells, 5 on the left side, 5 on the right side, over 2 floors, 20 men per cell. Most cells weren't able to escape and were still inside, but one cell escaped and must have gotten keys as they opened about 4 more. All the cells on the lower right side were open, which is roughly 100 men. A single hallway ran the perimeter of the cells, so we sent a team of riot shields in each direction to corral the detainees back to their cells. One team went right, the other left. I went behind my buddy who had a shield, and I had a taser. As we walked the halls, there are detainees in cells next to us and above us. They have igloo coolers that they use for tea and are filling them with whatever bodily fluids they can produce and raining it down on us. The noise, the smell, the thunder of hundreds of men pounding on the cages next to us. Pieces of building and debris are crunching under our footsteps as we make our way back around to the left side. We are now on the back door of the building, which is the entrance to the rec yard. It was empty. The detainees must have realized there was no escape from the rec yard and came in after beating the shit out of the ICOs. I didn't see them either. We shut and locked the door and continued around the perimeter hallway. We now made it around the right side. Here we found all the detainees charging and getting ready to fight the other line of shielded guard force. The cells had a layer of plexiglass split shields that have now been shattered into swords, which the detainees are now wielding. The 2 teams of shields began to come together, forcing the detainees towards the center. Most of the detainees gave up and simply went right back to their cells, but about 20 were persistent and came charging from the shields where they were easily detained. We finally pushed the last of the fighters back through the hole in the cell they busted out of. These prisons were built really cheap. These cells didn't have bars. They just had a single layer of expanded metal grating as bars. They were able to beat the hole in using an old man's crutches. It was about 3 feet in diameter, and we got the detainees back in the cell, but now we had to go through and cuff them. My buddy and I were the first to crawl through the hole. He put his shield in first and followed behind it. There are about 10 to 15 men in there. Most of them had already given up and laid down, but 5 or so wanted to fight. I crawled through immediately behind my friend and instantly deployed my taser. Homie hit the ground. Funny thing about a taser is it can still tase you with the gun portion after I fired the leads. Only those leads still shock every time I pulled the trigger. So the poor bastard I got with the leads had to get shocked again and again every time I had to use the gun to tase one of his buddies. It didn't take long for more guard force to get in behind us, so the detainees gave up quickly. We cuffed them and began moving out, then went to clean the cocktail of bodily fluids over ourselves. This was all at the end of my 12-hour shift. What a day. The ICOs who originally lost the prison were okay. The detainees beat the hell out of them, but spared them. They didn't come back to work as far as I know. I did a bid in Florida about 4 years ago. While I was inside, they let my cell block come down into the common area to watch the iHeartRadio Awards. Never would have watched it on my own, but it was nice to have the distraction. This was the summer that Ariana Grande had the One Less Problem song, and she performed it right before J-Lo came to the stage. Now I'm in with mostly Puerto Rican inmates, so J-Lo being on was a big goddamn deal. Some dude just loses his shit during the Ariana Grande song, and some of the dudes said he was into little girls or something, and throws a very lightweight plastic chair at the TV. Didn't think it would do much, but it busted the LCD, and all hell broke loose. Dudes weren't going to get a chance to see J-Lo's ass, and they wanted blood for it. I ran my gringo back behind to my cell, and a 60-man brawl ensued. All of this to say, in the midst of the insanity, one guy bit another guy's thumb off and swallowed it. I have a family member who worked as staff at a state prison in California. Their job required them to work inside the prison. This was 2010. There was another staffer who worked there. Her name, Samantha. Samantha was an attractive 30-year-old who was happily married and had 2 kids. She was generally well liked, and nobody thought her behavior was strange or different. One day, the prison started having a major issue with cell phones being smuggled in. Lots of cell phones. The prison launched a huge investigation, complete with shakedown, squeezing troublemaker inmates, the whole 9 yards. In one of the sweeps, they found a love note between one of the inmates and Samantha. For anyone who doesn't know, prison guards and staff are absolutely prohibited from having any form of relations with inmates. It's a serious crime that is prosecuted on a frighteningly regular basis. Turns out, Samantha was not only having a sexual relationship with the inmate who had the letter, but she was actively sleeping with 6 other inmates. So, she was screwing around and exchanging long love letters with a total of 7 inmates simultaneously. One of the inmates had convinced her to smuggle in cell phones through the dry cleaning inmate work program. They estimate she smuggled in at least 50 phones this way. One of the other inmates she was involved with had been having his drug dealing proceeds from the street deposited into her personal savings account on the outside, so that they'd have money to run away together when he got out. And the inmate was serving a 17-year prison term. When this was discovered, there was a major fallout from the staff and inmates in the prison. Security was tightened considerably, and the dry cleaning work program was suspended, and Samantha was arrested and, eventually, sentenced to just over 3 years in prison. The craziest thing about the whole situation? Samantha's husband stayed with her. She got out of prison several years ago, and they're still seemingly happy family once again. This didn't happen to me, but my dad, who was a warden for years. My dad opened up a prison that was developed by a for-profit incarceration company, and it was quite the shit show when my dad was brought on. Even the construction had problems. Things like you could see from the men's shower directly into the women's shower, and vice versa. He had entirely new staff, new corrections, and fresh out of the academy, besides him and his second. Anyway, the week the facility opened, i.e. the week they got inmates, my dad's second comes to his office. "You've got to see this, Tom." "See what?" "I'm busy." "No, you really have to come down and see this." Dad goes down to the block, and inmates aren't exactly rioting, but they are all out of their cells refusing to follow orders. They're talking shit, getting worked up, and Dad's green staff are cowering in the control room. 300 inmates are pressing into the doors, getting loud and rowdy. My dad looks at the situation, his staff, his second, and says, "Stick on my 6, and all wades in. All the instigators are on the front of the crowd, but Dad doesn't engage them at all. He elbows his way through and goes straight to the back, where there are inmates who don't really give a crap, but like to watch the ruckus. The leaders of the pro-riot are stuck on the other side of the crowd, and my dad starts shouting commands. "What are you doing? Get back to your cells. We're on lockdown." People at the back start to disperse, and that gains momentum until it's just the few instigators, and now you can deal with the handful left. Plus, they've lost all their support. My dad is either really brave or really stupid, but prison stories are still my favourite. This didn't happen to me, but my stepdad's mother, Meg. She works as a prison guard, and her husband, my stepdad's stepdad, Steve, does construction and home renovation. Steve got a job to renovate a home after the previous tenants suddenly left the place and was found trashed. The carpet was ripped up, there were holes in the wall and garbage everywhere. The whole 9 yards. Now it was winter at this point, and the house hadn't been heated for a while, so everything was cold. He's clearing out the junk and grabs a big bundle of rug that's all wrapped up, but it's far too heavy for him to get out by himself. So the guy that he's working with comes up and they just lug it across the room and throw it out the window. When it lands below, it unrolls just a little, just enough, that a hand starts showing. Steve didn't even notice until a little bit later, when they're moving all the trash into a big garbage can, one of those industrial metal ones. And he sees this guy's hand. He'd been killed, and never heard how. And the guy wrapped the body up in the carpet, which he tore up from the floor, and left. Due to the cold, the body had frozen solid inside the carpet, and apparently kind of shattered, being thrown out the window. So fast forward a year or two, and they finally found the guy who did it. He goes back to jail where Meg works. It's a small town where most people know everyone else, so the guy knows it was Meg's husband who got him caught and hates her. Fast forward a few more months, and he ends up being stabbed to death with a fork. Something like 200 or more stabs, which is a solid 4 to 5 minutes of stabbing straight. Apparently, his torso was basically all mush. All of this because he had somehow snuck drugs into the jail and wouldn't share after his cellmate saw it. Meg said she didn't feel too bad about it. I was a corrections officer. When I was first on the job, I was doing an overtime shift in the maximum security unit. It was my Friday, 1 hour to go, and my birthday weekend at that. At 2 o'clock, while counting the minutes, a call comes out on the radio. Central Control active. IMS, Housing Unit 3. Inmate is refusing to cuff up and has already broken the fire sprinklers in his cell. Requesting A-team response and put B-team on standby. Now, IMS is code for locking down everything. When you hear an IMS call, that means every inmate that is not in a cell must be secured. It's serious shit. Because when an event like this occurs, other officers must leave their respective posts to assist. Which means officers that remain on their units while their counterparts assist are now even more outnumbered, and that can easily spiral out of control. In short, any event like this is a serious security threat. In this case, Max was put on lockdown, while the rest of the institution kept about their business. Interesting thing is, when an IMS comes out for Max, the collective prison sphincter cinches up a bit, because Max is where the real violent shit goes down. An A-team is always the first to respond, but the kicker with this one was the command to put the B-team on standby. That means that shit has hit the fan, and anyone not immediately supervising inmates would be required to respond if so commanded. A B-team deployment to Max would send the rest of the 7,000-bed institution to a complete lockdown. All doctor appointments, visits, movements throughout the building are completely locked down. You hear Sally Port doors slamming everywhere. Really cool to experience it, honestly. There's also C, D and E teams, if these were ever called. Well, it shouldn't ever get to that point. Anyway, being the new guy, I was elected to respond. When I arrived at the briefing area, we were immediately ordered to put on our riot gear and biohazard coveralls. Other officers helped me suit up with no skin exposed. Only being a few weeks out of the academy, I did shit myself. This was not only my first A-team response, but it was also a biohazard. Blood, semen, urine, shit? Which is it, Sergeant? All of them. I don't believe in Jesus, but I did briefly for that moment. When we were escorted onto the unit, it was a war zone. The entire housing unit was full of gas, fire alarms blaring, red lights flashing everywhere. Even though we had our gas masks on, it didn't help as we had to put them on in a hurry. The first responding officers had to go in without any protective gear. The guy was still in his cell. He had been gassed, maced, and hosed. He was unrelenting. I thought, he's gotta be on PCP. Then I remembered that this is Max. Nothing gets in or out. The inmate was arse naked, covered in God knows what, screaming unintelligibly. He was bleeding from his arms due to having bitten full chunks out of them. His cell was watered down from the sprinklers and from getting sprayed with any number of OC variants. The best part? This man is all naked, splendor and rage, and was 120% erect. The fullest I have ever seen. Something deep inside his primordial mind had gotten irrevocably turned on through all of this. Even his penis being exposed to an OC spray did nothing to stop it. We stuck up in a line for cell breaches, and 6 of us would line up in a stick. The guy on point always had the shield, and 2 to 5 had the cuffs. The last guy was the moderator. He or she would give the inmate a final opportunity to comply, because the pain was coming. Inmate, this is your last opportunity to approach the door and cuff up. Do you comply? Of course not. When this inmate saw us line up, however, something changed, as if the Holy Spirit spoke to him. He cuffed up and was dragged out of his cell, still erect by the way, and thrown into the shower. I didn't even get to breach the cell. The sight of 6 officers in full riot gear lining up outside your door, and knowing full well they're going to find a way to all fit in your cell in less than 3 seconds, can be a really humbling experience. I was working at a detention centre for youths. There are 3 staff on duty during the night, 2 awake and 1 person who sleeps in case there are behavioural issues that we need help with. It was early in the morning, around 6 a.m, and I decided to do my rounds and check the vehicles. Before I went outside, I went into the bathroom to take a piss. I took my walkie-talkie off and set it on the sink while I did my thing, and then left to check the vehicles. I finished and came back to the lounge area where my awake staff was sitting. I sat down for a couple of minutes before my co-worker asked, "Were you calling Melissa's name on the walkie-talkie?" I said, "No, I didn't. I thought maybe I'd accidentally pressed the button while I was moving around in the vehicle doing my inspections." So I went to grab my walkie from my belt to check, and realized it wasn't there. Then I remembered I'd left it in the bathroom the whole time I was away. I told her I'd left it in the bathroom, and she shuddered. So to explain a bit further, the awake staff keep their walkies set to channel 1, and when we need to speak with Melissa, we set it to channel 2. When I obtained my walkie, it was set on channel 1 still. I highly doubt that my awake co-worker would awaken the sleep staff for a joke, because they have a good relationship and a common understanding of how important sleep is. I am no longer a correctional officer, but worked for roughly 5 years. Thank God that's over. I was advised to move an inmate from strip to a different cell. Strip is an area that inmates that would harm themselves are placed, and are only given a smock suit, also referred to as a turtle suit. The inmate was acting irrationally by growling at me and shaking the bars. I called classification block and told them, due to safety, I would not move the inmate by myself. I also advised my supervisor of the same. Usually, they'd get a group of 4 guys to do it as safely as possible. This LT shows up and thinks he's hot shit and says he'll move him himself. I'm like, whatever, go ahead. But I already know it was going to go downhill. The LT opens the cell doors, and the inmate pushes him and runs past him butt naked. I start chasing the inmate down the hallway corridor. He was sprinting naked right towards a dead end. The inmate finally gets cornered and starts growling and roaring like a lion. Being cornered now, with nowhere to go, so he charges towards me. I used his full momentum and dump him right onto the floor. The inmate is still fighting and trying to bite and hit me. The LT is just standing there like a moron. Finally, my friends show up to help. The inmate fought for a good 30 seconds until he was injected by something by the emergency services crew. He fought so hard he ended up breaking his trachea, ribs, and an ankle. He flailed violently, just thrashing everywhere. Turns out he had received a drug that was laced with some bad shit. I talked to the inmate a week or so later, once the drug was out of his system, and he was like a different person, and ended up apologizing. Best thing was, this LT looked like a giant idiot, and a wuss, because it was all on camera. He stood by as his officer was trying to restrain a violent individual. That's something you'll never live down in your career, and it's remembered forever. There are so many other stories. Doing CPR on an inmate that had visibly broken his neck from a hanging suicide, because you have to until EMS shows up. Then having their ribs break and going down to their pelvis is something I'll never forget. Having an officer stabbed right in front of you with a shank is also a fun memory. Trying to process it all after and still doing your job, knowing that one day someone may go after you. Overdoses, brawls, stabbings, completed and attempted suicide. If you're a correctional officer for long enough, you will see it all. I was a correctional officer about 18 years ago at a max penitentiary for 14 to 24-year-olds. It was insane to me that so many young kids could be locked up with adults. We had a lot of construction going on in the prison, and they were bringing older convicts to do the work. One day, a young guy started talking shit to an older one, and the older dude hits him in the face with a coffee pot. Lots of cuts and lots of burns. Another time, one of the construction guys snuck a welding rod back into the prison and used it to stab another inmate through his throat. I'll never forget that. I couldn't tell who the victim was because of the amount of blood. Surprisingly, he survived. I was personally involved in two extreme situations. One came my first night being alone after training. A group of 5 inmates jumped me. First one hit me in the back of the head, and I went blind for a second. I couldn't get my bearings, but I knew I needed to get to the unit door so the guards upstairs could let me out and lock them in. I ran for the door covering my head, and luckily got out. When I was trying to shut the door, which was a large steel door with bolts that shot out locks when it was close to being closed, I shut in one of the inmate's feet. It crushed his foot. I don't know if they were able to save the foot. He was transferred from the hospital to another facility. Then, one other time, a guy didn't want to go back into his cell, so he tried to fight me. We were on a balcony about 12 feet up. Imagine a second-floor outdoor hotel. There was a line of cells on the first floor, with stairs on each end that led up to a line of cells on the second. Anyway, he was trying to push me over the railing. We wrestled for a bit, and then when he tried to push me off, I started hitting him. In the scuffle, he ended up trying to run and jump over the railing. I think he wanted to kill himself, but he landed on both feet, which shattered both of his ankles. I used to work as a corrections officer, and have plenty of really creepy stuff that happened over those 5 years. But this is by far my favourite incident. I was assigned to the single-man cells wing of the jail, which is basically solitary confinement for inmates who were being punished for breaking the rules in jail. So around 5 AM, medics call for all inmates that need medication to be escorted from my wing to medical to receive their meds. I pull out 2 guys, restrain them, and instruct them to face the wall and await the guard who will be escorting them. As the three of us are there, I begin to hear a woman crying. I was new to that jail, so I didn't think anything of it, and I'm just listening to this woman cry, and I slowly start to realize a few things. There are no females in this wing, nor any wing where men are. The female wing is down the hall, sealed tight, with about 3 doors in between the hall and the actual wing. There are only about 2 other males in the wing who are sleeping aside from us 3. I look up at the inmates and notice they have this kind of smile on their face as they're watching me realize what's going on, and I ask them, "Do you guys hear that?" One of the inmates responds, "Almost every night, boss." That same night, or morning rather, when we were assigned to a certain wing, we had to do exit door checks, which was basically going to the exit door of the wing and checking the fire door to make sure it was secured, and then radioing into control every few hours. As I was making my way down a very long hall, with empty single-man cells to my left and right, I could hear knocking at the end of the hall, but it wasn't coming from the exit door. It was coming from one of the cells on the right-hand side. As I would gradually move closer, I could hear at the end of the hall that the knocks were getting louder. When I got to the end, the knocks seemed to have gone away, so I grabbed the exit door to make sure it was secure, and a very distinct and loud knock came from the cell on my right-hand side. I'd seen enough horror films to not look into that empty cell, and decided it would be best to just get out. My dad was a PE officer in the prison service for a couple of decades. He has a few stories. One that I always remember was about this kid who was about 16, but he was roughly 6'4" and built like a tank. He also had a bit of a temper, and one day when my dad is supervising in the gym, he looks over to the benches and this kid picks up a 34-kilogram dumbbell, lifts it above his head and starts to swing it down on another inmate's head, who is laying on one of the benches. My dad manages to sprint over and grab the kid and pin him against the wall, just in time to stop him from killing the other inmate. At this point, my dad is thinking, if this kid wants to fight, he's probably going to win. But luckily, he had a good reputation, so the kid didn't fight, but also other inmates alerted the guards. If he was able to carry through with that swing, the inmate's head would have literally exploded. There is no other outcome to that. It was straight up attempted murder. Nothing ended up happening with the kid. The prison head didn't deem it to be much of an issue because no one was hurt, and my dad brought the 34-kilogram dumbbell into the meeting just to show her. Just think of how heavy that thing is. Alas, she didn't care. She ignored it because it makes her prison look better on paper. I was a corrections officer for almost a decade. I worked segregation and psychiatric unit for most of it. In the segregation unit, some guys are supposed to be allowed to rec together, and some are supposed to be kept separate, for theirs or others' safety. 2 inmates that had been heard threatening each other were accidentally let out together. In the 90 seconds from their cell doors opening to the time we stopped the fight, one of the inmates had knocked the other down, kicked his head and stomach, and then kicked his scrotum so hard that the testicles tore their way out of the skin and became true external genitalia. In the psych unit, it's not uncommon for inmates to pay others, inmate janitors, one-on-one psych watchers, etc., to get a piece of razor blade. When I say a piece, I mean something like 1/8 or 1/10 of the blade. They do this in order to self-harm, whether it's to actually accomplish the act or just to get more attention. On one particular occasion, an inmate procured one of these small pieces and managed to use it to cut through his abdominal wall in about 10 minutes. We were made aware of the problem by him banging on his cell door while he stood in the window chewing on his own intestines. Those are certainly stories I won't forget. 2 years ago, I was working as a gun rail officer for my squad, which is the recreational yard area for a set of 4 housing units. I'm monitoring my area when all of a sudden I hear shots fired in the quad adjacent to mine, followed by absolutely frantic radio chatter. An inmate was being brought back from the infirmary, where he was being treated from a fight that he had been in earlier that day. As he was entering the quad, 2 other inmates rushed him. The escorting officers attempted to spray the aggressors with OC, but they ran through it and stabbed the inmate to death. Nearly the entire institution responded to the incident, and all I could do was recall and lock down my squad and provide any additional gun coverage to them. The CERT lieutenant performed CPR, while they brought down 2 crash carts from the infirmary in an attempt to stabilize him. But he'd already lost so much blood that he died before the fight for his life had even gotten to the institution. Apparently, he'd been stabbed multiple times in the liver, stomach, kidneys, and lungs. To this day, the shank that the aggressors used is the biggest I've ever seen. The following months, the entire institution was on lockdown. It was just all bad. The most intense thing is between responding to a man hanging himself in a seg cell and human instinct telling me to open the door and cut the sheet, but training kicking in to wait for backup. Or the first time I got a ride in a helicopter. An offender took the chain off a weight bench and beat another officer with it. The victim held his arm above his head and blocked most of the attacks. He had to be flown out though, because the swelling in his arm was so severe it would kill him. It never occurred to 19-year-old me that you could die from a deeply bruised arm. The most extreme thing I've seen? I see some guys grouped around this bunk, sometimes a sign something is about to happen, and I go to see what's up. It's a bunch of young dudes, and they come wave over to me. Bro, no homo, but look at this guy's dick, they say. Oh no, I'm good, and I carry on. No, it's cool, look. They were filing down domino pieces into heart shapes and stars, and slicing open their penises, inserting the dominoes and stitching them back up. In prison. They're doing this in prison because their girls love it. Weeks later, I got to go on another medical run because this dude's member became so inflamed and infected that his penis split open. He needed emergency surgery to stitch it back up. It had been infected for days, but he never told anyone because he was more afraid of getting in trouble. I am a male, and that story I believe is the most extreme. That image and his screams still make me cringe. My dad worked in a maximum security prison for over 25 years and said that they were watching the cameras and one inmate snuck up and stabbed another over and over, like tens of times, over and over and over again. So the guards are scrambling to get there and try to save this guy's life. They get there and there's no blood and they're still fighting. They break up and turns out the guy's sharpened toothbrush wasn't sharp at all, and he didn't even break the guy's skin with those stabs. On another occasion, I asked him what was the most inventive thing he's seen made, and he said that they found 2 pull-up bars, a C-shaped handle attached to an inmate's ceiling for pull-ups, made out of oatmeal or something like oatmeal, and toilet paper, like a paper mache. He said it was so strong, not only could it support a grown man hanging from it, he had to hit it off the wall piece by piece with his flashlight before it came down. I work in a hospital near a prison. These guys will gash their scrotes from dick to gooch for a trip out to see us, and they'll do it in teams. It's been happening for years. Bunch of guys via EMS with their self-bloodied goonies hanging out. Cells get tossed more often over there now because we're not a huge hospital, and they do it in the middle of the night, which can really tie up our ER staff, which makes other patients wait or causes us to go on divert status. Dispatch divert EMS to other hospitals because our ER resources are tied up for a brief time. Anyway, about a week ago, one of those guys got an extended stay with us due to sepsis after his wound became infected. Since I work ER and ICU, I was able to follow his case. Scrotal edema. It's pretty common in the ICU due to large amounts of IV fluid and the way patients are positioned in the bed. The guy's balls wouldn't heal. The wound just festered and wept and stank. He eventually had to have surgery to remove a bunch of neurotic tissue, inside and out, from scrot, gooch, thigh, and part of an arse cheek. He almost died, and he really just carried himself through like a regular guy for his entire stay. My sister worked for 1 week only at the state prison as a nurse, and quit. Why? There was this 20-year-old Latino kid who got in trouble with the wrong sort. So for a weed charge, he was caught with a bigger amount that he had planned for a party. He got his ass thrown in jail, with major offenders for possession, with intent to distribute. War on drugs, right? So he goes in and joins a Latin gang, like you're supposed to do when you go to jail. And they decide to use him as a fleshlight. He was raped so much that he decided to jump off the top bunk and land on his knees. By the time he was in hospital, he'd lost a good 50% of bowel control. I used to visit jail once a week with my golden retriever, Cooper, who's a therapy dog. Any normal day, I was asked for cigarettes or to smuggle something into my next visit, as I was never searched or walked through metal detectors upon entry. Don't worry, I never did. Anyway, my last visit there was around lunchtime. I entered a cell with 5 or 6 inmates who were Southside Los Angeles gang members. Inmates always made the craziest concoctions of sauces, and each gang had their own recipe of sauces, and my dog bolted for a glob of their sauce that was on the ground. After he ate it, the whole cell erupted saying, "Cooper is Southside," and the chant spread to the rest of the cells on the row, and then to the rest of the 7 level rows of roughly 150 inmates. The jail went into riot prevention and lockdown ensued. Cooper was then listed as a gang-affiliated citizen, and we were no longer allowed to visit. I used to be an inmate, and have seen lots of crazy shit. We were all housed in a dorm, like set somewhere in the range of 24 guys. New guy comes in who is carrying some stuff in his arse. So a couple of dudes, who are fresh in from parole violations, catch wind that he's holding some stuff. They go over and basically tell him he's handing it over, or he'll be forced to. So after lights go out, he goes over to the shitter and is trying to force himself to push it out. But he can't. After a few hours of false attempts, the pen timer grabs the guy and forces him to the ground. One dude takes the side handle of a plastic spoon and starts going into the guy's arse. Poor guy is trying to scream, but can't because the other guy is straight choking him out. Finally, the guy passes out, and the Spoo dude continues his search. Somehow, he managed to pull a balloon full of heroin and coke from the dude's arse. The moment this guy woke up, he checked off that unit, and that was that. A family member and I used to work at the same prison, and the prisoners knew that we were related. My family member got into a minor car accident and had a few weeks off to recover. Word got out about it to all the prisoners, and I constantly got asked how I was coping, because they all heard it was super serious, and it wasn't. While one was asking me what happened when we had lockdown code, so everyone had to go back to their blocks, I came to find out in the incident report that a fight had started because two prisoners heard two different stories of what happened to my family member. They couldn't agree, started a punch-up, and got the whole block of 80 guys fighting. The whole place got locked down because of 10 hours. All because my family member can't drive. When I worked third shift at a jail, we had to take paperwork to the office, which was several interlocked doors away from many people. Lots of people claimed it was haunted, but I had been there tons of times and never witnessed anything. One night I was over there putting my paperwork into the superintendent's mailbox and heard voices, but not regular voices, electronic sounding voices, coming from the fax machine. I couldn't really understand much, but I heard my name and the name of a guy I was working with and got the hell out of there. It never happened again. On a slightly related note, there was this guy who worked thirds in the other section of the building. There was a holding section for those waiting for court that he worked in, and a felony offender unit which I worked in. He used to call me on my work phone. Bear in mind, these are internal only phones, so literally only 2 other people could call me, and we watched him doing it on camera, and hang up and just creepily watch me all the time. He used to go outside late at night and smoke, so one night I snuck out our back entrance and made a bunch of weird-ass noises to scare him. He ran back inside and told everyone he was calling the cops, because there were people screaming and animals eating them or something. The other staff talked him down, but he warned everyone about it until he quit. It was hilarious.